Chapter 5. A battle is unpredictable. The camp awoke to the banging of iron on steel and the sizzle of water. The booming voices of blacksmiths finishing weapons and armor carried orders to their apprentices. Sitting somberly and preparing himself, Rayleigh stared deeply into his sword. With a soft sheepskin rag, he gently wiped the blade clean from tip to hilt. He held the edge up with one hand, checking it for spots as Tyreen barked orders across the small collection of tents. The flaps to the makeshift barracks pushed open, and he called in for Rayleigh.
"Did you read our orders? Oh, I see you're getting your equipment ready."
Rayleigh handed over the parchment he'd found attached to his tent.
"I read on that notice that we're to be the vanguard for tonight's assault."
Tyreen checked the soldiers' equipment.
"Nervous? Don't worry too much. You'll do fine."
Smiling affectionately at the blade, Rayleigh set it down next to his bunk and stood.
"Surprisingly, the assault isn't what's bothering me. It's these endless nights. The daylight's nothing but a tease."
Tyreen looked to the sky and then the horizon.
"I can see how it would be a bit unsettling if you're not used to it."
He let out a sigh.
"Get your stuff together. We're meeting up at my tent."
Rayleigh took a deep breath and released it. A calming chill blanketing his goosebump-covered torso. He started organizing his things and checking his rations. The sleeping raven's chest deflated as it awoke, and stretching its wings the bird flew out of the tent and into the night. Tyreen, walking away from Rayleigh's tent, listened to his men's chatter.
"Is that a wireless clock on a wood stump?"
he thought to himself. Landing on the clock, a carrion bird laughed at him.
"Is this an omen?"
he wondered.
"Damn, it's only 6 in the morning."
He gathered himself and continued through the shadows to his own tent. The sun brightened in the hazel sky for a moment, its light tainted by the irradiated clouds. The well-fed fire continued to dance, spreading joy across Paul Vale. In the town center, Hirian sat drinking the famous Paul Vale ale from a broken barrel, watching as a freshly boiled skull was prepared from one of the villagers. Terrified and stricken, the remaining city folk stood before the giant king. These were the ones who had been trapped by their own fear and hid in their homes, squandering their opportunity to flee. The majority of the fighting men had already been boiled alive and eaten. The rest had begun to break down. Leading the group was the city's mayor, who was working hard not to let his own anxiety stoke that of his already terrified group. But he could do little to hide the fear carved into his face. Trying to stay calm, the civil leader rubbed his wet palms against his mud-caked, blood-stained clothes. One of the Lestrygonian scouts entered the town square, garbed in wolf and bear furs, and nimbly worked his way toward his celebrating king. Wearily, the scout made his report, looking the king straight in the eye.
"We have guests, my king. An army extensive enough to match ours has reached the southern plains just outside the town."
The king crushed the barrel of ale he held in his hands, sending a flood of beer and wood fragments raining down on the pavement. Rising from his makeshift throne of corpses, he bellowed an enthusiastic order that echoed down the empty streets in every direction from the square.
"Make ready for battle."
Turning to the scout, he asked,
"How are they here? Have our plans been leaked?"
As the smaller giant provided more details, his army gathered, and Hirian yelled again.
"Prepare for war."
The army roared back, shaking the walls of the city.
"You, Giant Kin, I have a task for you."
A Lestrygonian scout barely over 7 feet came to the king's call.
"Deliver my words to the Spear Sisters coming from the northern mountains. Tell Ravina that the plan changed, and we are preparing for a siege. They will aid us in defending our spoils. Now go. Make haste."
The young giant took off snappily, heading north out of the town. The cold wind transformed his hot breath to steam, giving Hirian the appearance of a fire breather. The sight broke the minds of the villagers and they panicked. The giants began herding their new slaves back into the building they used as a prison. It reeked of vomit and feces. The Lestrygonians terrorized the prisoners on the way, describing the sweet taste of human flesh and tears. Mayor Robstein worked to show strength and doing whatever he could to calm his people.
"Stay down and out of sight. If a chance comes, we can escape, but we need our wits about us."
Finding a clean place to sit at the back, the group of 50 or so, mostly women, began setting up overturned tables to shield themselves. They sat without a sound, waiting to see what fate had in store for them. Hyrion's vigor, meanwhile, empowered his giant army. His affinity for earth manipulation hardened their skin like iron, and the giant army rallied with their king's power, setting fire to buildings as they gathered in formation and prepared to attack anything that came through the gates of Paul Vale. The sun began to settle, and the brisk night welcomed all to Paul Vale. Fully armored in heavy leather and unpolished iron, Tyrene addressed his 400 soldiers.
Tonight we may live, tonight we may die. But tomorrow is never promised. We have been asked to lead the charge against the Lestrygonian army holding this city hostage. We will engage our enemy and keep them occupied until Clan Cura's reinforcements and our own army arrive. Show no mercy and we will prevail.
With a crash of weapons on shields, the band set forth into the deep fog. Rayleigh advanced with the second wave of the company, gripping his hilt and preparing mentally for what was to come. The 6 who had been introduced to him earlier led the way into the valley. With each step, the soft ground gripped their boots and muddied fingers. At a small gesture from Tyrene, the band stopped. They moved like a well-oiled machine, each part ready to pick up and start again. Lilith stepped forward, pushing hair from her face, and began weaving her fingers like a maestro. Lightning crackled and ran across the sky. With a light wave of her hand, she manipulated the wind, drawing up the mischievous flames around the town and shaping them into a hurricane of fire. It grew and fed on itself until it was hot enough to engulf the city. Shifting her weight, she sent the firestorm out into every corner of the small town. Lightning struck the barrier of fire and wind, probing it as if looking for a way to penetrate, and hit the ground near the construct. The wild electric storm merged with Lilith's magic, solidifying the wall with electricity, trapping the city in an elemental bubble. Stepping back behind the first line of soldiers, Lilith leaned up against a tree, panting. She focused her breathing, trying to regain stamina and mental fortitude. Setting up the barrier had taken more effort than she expected. The dark, heavy, and volatile energy in the area was unfamiliar to her, and it was all she could do to change it into something usable. She felt an intense wave of lightheadedness and staggered back to find a place where she could rest and regain her composure. Tyrene's instincts were sharpened with concentration. When Lilith finished her task, he scrutinized the southern gate of Paul Vale. Unblinking, he issued the order to attack and kill all combatants separated outside the city, keeping them from the primary invading force. Snarling, drooling, and frenzied, the isolated Lestrygonians gritted their teeth as they sniffed the putrid air of the attacking army. Lowering their stances, the savage monstrosities charged their giant bodies into the mass of soldiers, crushing everything in their path. The giants used their overwhelming strength and momentum to drive Tyrene's men back, smashing the soldiers' armor with giant bone axes and clubs, sending them flying across the battlefield. Bodies crashed into the charging band of the wolf, killing the men from the force of the blows. Lestrygonians tore through flesh, showering their foes in blood. Weighted steps drove the fallen soldiers into the ground, bursting their bodies and sending bone shards exploding outward like shrapnel, piercing more armor and sending combatants down from ruptured wounds. Wave after wave, the band of the wolf charged in with a single mind, to take down the mightiest warriors in front of them at all costs. But fear and anguish spread through the soldiers as their friends perished like nothing. With his height, Rayleigh watched as soldiers were flung about and pulverized. He focused on what was around him. Then he heard the command of a raven.
Down!
Bodies flew by, just missing him and crashing somewhere behind. The force of their impacts shattered bones and left only impact craters filled with gelatinous puddles. The sight of giant holes with soldiers mashed into them caused even more fear and panic. Rayleigh realized that the next wave of soldiers being sent in included him. He looked to the horizon before him. Rayleigh was a veteran to battlefields, but he stepped forward with a cold sweat. The order to charge was given, and the soldiers burst forward with a frenzied zeal. Taking control of his fear, Rayleigh made his way further forward as bodies were thrown around him, fracturing where they hit the ground, erupting across the front line and piercing armor and flesh, killing soldiers several at a time. Lilith lay against a scarred oak tree, still not recovered from weaving. The elemental energies maintained the barrier around Paul Vale. As Rayleigh stepped into a wave of troops, she followed his movement, weaving in and out of combat, just avoiding exploding bodies and blows from giant axes. She lost sight of him in a fog of blood. She watched with helpless anticipation as more soldiers vanished into the mist, or fell to their knees, paralyzed with fear, as their weapons failed to pierce giant flesh. Still not having reached any targets, and already drenched in blood, Rayleigh pushed on as man after man fell around him. He dodged flying human bodies, zigzagging through narrow openings between ragdoll corpses and charging giants. Screams echoed in his ears. With a quick step to the right, he placed hand to hilt, and drew his blade cleanly from its sheath to meet a Lestrygonian battle axe made of melded human bone and steel. His sword shattered on contact, and the shards exploded toward him, leaving shallow cuts on his face. Stunned from the blow, Rayleigh watched the oversized axe come whistling down. The weapon twisted in midair, just missing, as the raven drove its beak into the giant's eye, throwing its balance off. Blood covered the giant's face as Rayleigh's new friend flew back into the sky. Switching direction, the giant swung back sideways at Rayleigh's body, sending the man flying across the battlefield. Losing all breath, he crashed into the field. Gasping for air, Rayleigh stood and tried to get his bearings. All he saw were body parts of fellow soldiers littered around him. Moans of pain and grief spread across the field. Scrambling wearily over the corpses, Rayleigh scanned for another weapon as he made his way back toward the fight. Ahead, a blood-covered claymore stood erect over a pile of bodies, pinning them to the ground. The huge blade was made to terrify. A long crack ran down the iron blade to a bone hilt that was broken in half. Rayleigh felt a surge of cold energy run through him. With a burst of power, he made an air dash and reached for the broken hilt. Tearing a length of cloth from a body, he wrapped the broken grip so he could hold the blade without cutting his hands. Then he shifted his weight back, pulling the sword out of the corpses and landing on his feet. He headed forward, back into the chaos of the battle. The southern group of the Band of a Wolf was all but annihilated. Less than 50 soldiers were standing, and only a few were still willing to fight. As they began retreating, Rayleigh made his way forward, his body acting on its own, cutting down Lestrygonian after Lestrygonian with the great sword. Sensing an attack, he pulled the sword up, using it as a shield to block a great axe blow. The force of the impact broke his ribs. Coughing and spitting blood, Rayleigh gritted his teeth again. He leaned forward, gripping the ground with his toes. Pushing off at a steep angle, he pierced the giant's leg and twisted the blade, cutting deep into the flesh and reaching bone. The Lestrygonian toppled forward, and Rayleigh, down on one knee, summoned all his strength and exploded upward, cutting the Lestrygonian in half.
The southern battalion is all but lost, sir.
Tyreen turned to the messenger.
There are only 50 survivors of the 200 you sent.
He felt sick to his stomach.
What the hell is Kramer doing?
The stench of his men's bodies caused his stomach to turn, and he gritted his teeth.
Send word to Walker at the west gate and to Belin and Yoshi at the east. I want them to do whatever is needed to deal with the threat. Send a message to Kramer. Have him collect Lilith and head for the southern gates. They are to create a diversion to collect any survivors and return here.
The young man, looking like a startled deer, wrote everything down word for word. As soon as Tyreen finished, he sprinted off to the scribes, who hastily copied the orders out on new parchment and sent scouts off into the haze. Leaning against the claymore, Rayleigh tried to control his breathing. Fog blanketed the battlefield. He'd fought his way through the gates, and looking around he saw he was deep inside the city, almost to the southern bridge. Raging heat and lightning spewing out of the elemental barrier created a heat wall that did little to hide the giant shadows behind it. Lestrygonians were gathering to the east and west of him. Pulling the sword out of the ground, he rested the blade on his shoulder and gazed through the thick mist, silently allowing it to devour him. The red smoke provided just enough cover to conceal him. As he regained stamina, Rayleigh lowered the sword and watched the giant shadows lurking through the fog. Bending his knees, he took a basic sword stance he'd learned in the academy and leaned forward, shifting his weight onto his left leg. He jetted out of the mist, catching the giants by surprise. He needed one swing per giant, slicing two of the creatures in half. Leaving the others confused and in disarray, he faded back into the fog again, looking for the next colossal shadow to cut down. Lieutenant Rama, leading the rest of his forces steadily up from the south, reached the fields where the band of wolves had been deployed. Mangled corpses littered the ground, and rivers of blood had saturated the earth till it wouldn't soak up anymore. Craters pocked the whole span of the battlefield. Looking north, Rama saw the barrier of fire and lightning still caging the city. With a gesture, he deployed his army to reinforce what was left of the vanguard. Cold sweat dripped from his brow at the sight of his soldiers' torn-up bodies. He swallowed his saliva and pushed his men forward. Heavy horses and armored cavalry trampled the corpses still further, driving them deep into the soft ground. At another gesture, the infantry on the right flank turned east, and the cavalry on the left headed west. Rama moved forward without breaking his horse's stride, leading the rest of his force north into the thickening haze. Blinded by the fog, Rayleigh stood still, closing his eyes, doing what he could to give his strained vision some relief. The mechanical organisms in his body made his limbs tingle numbly. He'd found he could sense the microorganisms in every muscle twitch. Working at full capacity sent a massive amount of information to his brain, heightening his senses, and he quickly became attuned to the nanomachines living within him. They were running at 100%. With every breath, his body consumed more energy. Rayleigh opened his eyes. He could see clearly through the fog now, and his other senses had intensified. Needing a focus, he cut his hand. The pain cleared his mind. He gripped the sword again, blood dripping from his hand and down the bone handle mixing with the sweat and blood already there. He moved to the west, looking for an advantage on the group of giants ahead of him. Exhausted, the Lestrygonians huddled around their leader, receiving orders. Dripping with sweat and blood, they peered into the dense blanketing fog, probing the clouds with their weapons and searching for a way through the barrier that stood between them and their brethren. Lunging out of the mist, Rayleigh leaped into the sky and came down on two unsuspecting Lestrygonians, cutting both in half with a one-armed swing of the giant's sword. Surging with power and speed, Rayleigh wielded the massive blade like a short sword, slashing in every direction with little technique and dancing around his slower attackers. Time had slowed around him. His mind fogged, as if in a dream, and his body drew on its connection to the veil, attuning itself to the dark realm and drawing in large amounts of energy. The swell of power guided Rayleigh, overwhelming his senses and boosting his combat abilities. He began to see glimpses of the future as showing him a few precious seconds, allowing the exhausted warrior to predict his enemy's next moves, reading each remaining Lestrygonians in turn and cutting them down with ease. Adrenaline took over as he landed, and he felt himself giving in to his bloodlust. He moved his head slowly, searching for new targets. Remembering the group to the east, he set off with incredible speed, reaching them quickly and taking out two barbarously. Dodging an attack, Rayleigh drove his sword upward, slicing through one of the giants, before falling back to the ground. Exhilarated, he let himself to sink deeper into his gluttonous adrenaline-driven frenzy, gradually losing his self-awareness. Kramer watched the battle leaning from the branch of a giant redwood, leaning on the trunk while juggling dice in one hand and twirling a dagger in the other. Below, a messenger appeared and began climbing. He stopped when he reached Kramer and handed him a parchment. Reading it, Kramer smiled.
Finally. A date with Lilith. Just when I was getting bored.
His twisted smile sent a chill down the messenger's spine. Noticing that the young man was still looking at him, Kramer snarled ferally, setting him off balance, before jumping from the branch with glee and skipped out of the forest and onto the battlefield, throwing daggers in random directions, not caring who was hit. Taken aback, the messenger dropped down from the tree to find Lieutenant Rama. He found Kramer standing before him, staring at the young man with cold, condescending eyes. He cut the messenger's throat with a quick slash, and a smile radiated across his face. He laughed and danced in joy, licking the man's blood from the dagger, and his eyes lit up crimson, even as the messenger's severed head hit the ground, the face frozen in surprise. Picking up the head and twirling it by the hair, Kramer skipped out of the forest once more, while darkness consumed the body behind him. He crossed the battlefield carelessly, changing his path to avoid confrontations and sneaking in behind the scattered Firenze army. A supply officer, seeing the lanky man skipping and whistling while twirling the human head about, bent over and puked. When he looked up, Kramer caught his eye and raised an index finger to his lips. The man scrambled away toward his commanding officer. Kramer, not breaking stride, continued on toward where he'd last seen Lilith. The stress of the battle allowed him to slip through with little notice. Excited as he was about seeing Lilith, Kramer enjoyed watching the one-sided massacre of the troops he was supposed to be leading and supporting. The army was being torn to shreds by giant marauders with battle axes. Blood exploded around him, stunning the soldiers. Leaderless, the men panicked and fell to the giants. Screams echoed about, hitting Kramer's deaf ears. He was focused on reaching Lilith. Then cries of giants rang out, causing Kramer to stop and take notice. Through the mist of blood, he could just make out the silhouette of a soldier fighting for his life. Kramer moved on indifferently until he finally caught the scent of lavender.
Lilith,
He sang out. A colossal tree spread its arms wide, the shadows of its leaves giving some protection to Lilith, who lay tucked away against the trunk of the great tree.